I am pleased to speak today with Rachel Rivenc, who is the head of conservation and preservation at the Getty Research Institute. Prior to that, she worked at the Getty Conservation Institute as a part of the Modern and Contemporary Art Initiative, as project specialist overseeing the dissemination, training and research activities related to modern and contemporary art. And before that, she was also active as associate scientist researching the materials and processes used by contemporary artists and the conservation challenges that they pose. Before coming to the GCI, Rachel taught paintings conservation at the University of Malta and worked as a conservator in private practice in France and the UK. She's the coordinator of the Modern Materials and Contemporary Art Working Group of ICOMCC and sits on the steering committee of the International Network for the Conservation of Contemporary Art. Rachel holds a master's degree in paintings conservation from Paris 1 Sorbonne and received her PhD from the Université de Versailles. And I know of her writing on performance, which have been really important. And this is why I'm really, really pleased, Rachel, that you agreed to join me today. And here are my two questions. Can performance be conserved? If so, how? And if not, why not? And what does it mean to conserve performance?
Thank you, Anna. So can performance be conserved? I guess my short answer is I'm not sure. And I think it depends. I think it mainly depends of the type of performance. And of course, how is a whole other question. Here at the Getty Research Institute, we have a lot of material that is related to performance, but we don't acquire performance themselves, of course, except in the form of film, performance documentation. We have all the kitchen archive and other, we have the Caroline Schneemann archive and Yvonne Rainer and many different documentation, films. Sometimes the films themselves are artworks, but sometimes they're just documentation, which is also a fine line. And we have a lot of, for example, in the case of Caroline Schneemann, we have all her notebooks, everything that she used to prepare performances that are sometimes akin to scores, but not exactly scores. So sometimes there's drawings, there's annotation of costumes, there is often narratives about her dreams that she then used to create her performances. And so regarding the question of how can performance be conserved, I would say that not necessarily. I think I have witnessed a sort of professionalization and institutionalization of the field of performance art in recent years and decades. So I think sometimes now younger artists produce or create performances with in mind the fact that they can be reenacted, which of course is a form of conservation. And so they provide institutions with that documentation. And in that case, the performances can be reenacted. But I remember discussing with my colleague Anja Forschner, with whom we worked on Caroline Schneemann, and she often teased me saying, like, conservators are obsessed with reenactment of performances, because I guess that's the most obvious form of conservation we can think of, but it's not the only one, and it's not even necessarily the best one. As I'm sure you know, there is a whole controversy on whether performance art can even be documented without altering its integrity or sort of producing a shift in its identity. And I don't really have an answer to that. I can certainly see that point of view. And I think that something is lost when you're not witnessing the original event. So you can approximate it in a variety of ways, but I think there is always a loss. As frequently is the case anywhere in conservation, when you approach the conservation of something, it's because often, you know, something has changed, something is lost. So you're approaching an object as like, how can I present this object in a way that's truthful to what the object is meant to be, and, you know, notwithstanding that change. And in a way, in a very different way, it is the case for performance as well, that something is lost and you're trying to find ways to present this work of art nevertheless. So I was thinking today of Pip Lawrence's foundational article for time-based media on allographic and autographic works. And I think in some ways it applies a little bit to performance art, because I would say it's a very different scenario if the body of the artist is involved or not, or if they're performers that you can redirect. In fact, anything with a well-established score is much more akin maybe to a theater performance or something, or music performance, something you can in fact reenact. When it's the body of the artist, when the performance has also an element of spontaneity, can you recreate it, knowing that it's not just the artist himself or herself who's not there? It might be the context is completely different. And of course, there is the extensive sort of like the constellation of objects left behind by performances, and what meaning do they have, and what are they in respect to the performance? So two thoughts about that. One is, for example, we have the archive of the Women's Building here at the GRI, and an object that we've been very concerned with is, we call it affectionately the breast dress, but it's a dress that was made by Anne Goldin, who was a member of a performance group called the Waitresses, and that was a group that was created by her, Anne Goldin, and Terry Allen, and evolved to, you know, depending on the timing, it had up to 13 members, and they started in the late 70s. They started doing this improvisational and spontaneous performance at diners and coffee shops and restaurants, and diners were unaware of, you know, that they were going to see a performance. They didn't come to like a place to see art, they were just there dining, and then this performance happened, and they very much used humor to call attention to very serious issues of you know, sexism and sexual harassment, and it became broader social and political issues later on, but initially it was very focused on that. And so can you recreate that? I mean, you know, you'll never have the same context, although sadly gender inequality still exists, but, you know, you won't have the same socio-political context as you had in the 70s. And then can you recreate this unawareness of the diners, of the witnesses of the performances? I don't know. And I think of a choice that's been made with a sort of performative installation art, which is the Office of the Vietnam War by David Lamelas. You know, that was recreated by MoMA, and there was a choice of either updating, you know, the news coming through the fax machine and are read, and there was a choice by the artists together with the MoMA conservators to either keep the news of the Vietnam War at the time, or to maybe update it with a different war, since sadly imperialist wars are still going on. And I think David's choice at the time was to keep the Vietnam War news, not to update it, thinking it was still a very powerful, you know, it was still very powerful, and the loss of context didn't matter. It would, so that's one choice, but updating it would have been another choice. But then, you know, if you had updated it without the artist's involvement, what would that do to the work of art? Would that still have some level of authenticity? That's a whole other question. So so there's that, and you know, going back to the reenactment, I guess a curator could always decide to put on a performance again, but you know, what would that be? Would that be the work of art? Would that be the equivalent of a replica? Would that be, you know, would it be as fake as you know, these performances of historical event that sometimes they put on with costumes and they're quite popular? You know, would that be the equivalent of that? Something slightly, you know, grotesque in a way. Again, these are all questions that I grapple with and certainly don't have the answers, because you may also say it's better to have that than nothing at all. You know, at least you get an approximation of what the performance was. And then what I wanted to mention as well was when Anja Forschner and I interviewed Caroline Schneemann about her performances, she didn't really care that much whether it was her body, not her body. She just generally didn't feel her performances could be recreated. And but what she did is some sort of almost alchemical transmutation of her work, where the performance becomes a static installation, not completely static actually. She uses film documentation of her work. So for example, for the famous work Up to and Including Her Limits, where she was suspending from the ceiling, and there was the paper on the walls where she was just like balance and draw, kind of abstract expressionist while balancing herself and naked in this harness that she puts on that performances quite a few times, and every time I think they were a little different, but they were filmed. And so she eventually transformed that into an installation where there was the drawings, which are sort of a performance relic, but the harness, and then I think it's 6 monitors, each showing with 6 different channels, each showing films of that performance. And I think for her, that was the only way to sort of equate or approximate the power and the presence of the real performance, was to have multiple films and the objects. And it's not the performance, of course, but it was a way for her to approximate, yeah, again, its power and its presence and its impact. And I think there's something really powerful here in terms of how do you present something that is equivalent to the performance, but not the performance, that you give a sense of what it was about, what it was like to experience it. So that always struck me as something really, and of course only the artist can do that. You can come after and say, okay, well, we don't have the performance, so we're going to take this and that and, you know, mix it together to create a work of art. Only the artist can do that. Otherwise, it's just a documentary presentation. It's different. And then the other thought I wanted to share is the idea of that. What makes the difference between a performance relic and a performance paraphernalia, which is also really important, you know, because you have a sort of Chris Burden type of situation where you have a few images of the performance that are highly edited, in the sense the artist chose them and selected, you know, these 1 or 2 very specific images that don't necessarily reflect the entire performance, but these become the emblematic of the whole performance, and they become known as, I mean, that they become the channel through which the performance is known. I know that Carolee Schneemann, for example, hated that, this idea of having just this one image. And then you have, you have again, Burden also selected some bits and pieces of objects he had used in the performance and displayed them as stand-in for the whole thing. But the artist doesn't always go through this selection process. And then, you know, we as conservators and curators and archivists, we're left with a whole constellation of things, and it's what they are and how to present them and utilize them is tricky. So with to go back to the breast dress from the waitress, the waitress's performance group, I know the curator would love to show it standing upright on a mannequin as opposed to a, you know, a corpse or relic, so something having still some kind of life in it, but of course it wouldn't be worn, or it would, so I think it would be more sort of like documentary evidence that could be accompanied by screenings, you know, of the film, the documentation of the performances. But again, you're almost in a situation where it's not an art presentation, it's almost more of a you know, historical museum type of situation where you're given the facts and the documents and the material evidence about something. Again, here at the GRI, we mostly deal with everything around the performance. So the films, the photographs, the objects, the drawings, the performance announcements, the notes, the everything around that. But sometimes we don't have much information in you know, in Fluxus. We have a right now in the Fluxus Means Change exhibition that is presenting the archive of Jean Brown that we have up at the GRI right now. We have a number of objects that have been used during performances that we don't know exactly how they were used, or what was the performance. So again, the object becomes the only thing we know about the performance, and it's a very fractured and fragmentary way of getting to know performance art, but it is sometimes the only thing we have. And again, I think oftentimes getting to know a performance by everything around it is the only thing you can do, and it has a certain poetry to it because you then are left to imagine and filling the gaps.